Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. And I froze. All right. Hello. We are back. I think StreamYard's been having some problems the last couple of days. How are you, Robert?
I'm well. I'm just glad that there's a technology problem and it's not me.
It-
I'm in the middle
it's
of rural upstate New York, and bandwidth
yeah,
can be a near run thing up here. So usually, if there's tech problems, I'm the bad guy. So glad
yeah.
to be doing it right for once.
Well, welcome to those of you joining us. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. Welcome to this live show with Robert Pondiscio. If you are unfamiliar with Robert, and that's possible, you might be being some of us immerse
That's
ourselves in
all of you.
education. Okay. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on K-12 education curriculum, teaching, school choice, charter schooling. And I asked him here because we had a conversation a couple months ago, I guess now, and we only touched on the edge of elementary education. And it seemed to me that Robert didn't get enough time to go into what is, I know, a passion of his. He was an elementary school teacher. And so I want to give him the platform to tell us more, because I know we parents, other teachers, everybody who's interested in this topic want to hear more about the academics. We want to hear about what is missing from the elementary education that that ought to be there, or what are we doing wrong? And when I say wrong, I mean in ways that are not obviously demonstrably not helping our kids achieve what they need to continue on effectively throughout school. Before we get into that, I'd like to ask you who are present here to please like, share, and be prepared to comment on this show. We want it to be participatory, and let's begin. So, Robert, where are we going wrong?
How much time we got, Deb? Just an hour?
An hour. I know you probably
Okay.
could
Yeah,
talk about it for days, but
but I've been talking about it for 15 years already. So
yeah, let's get to
Um,
the meat of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be a helpful way to start to just kind of give a little bit of my own kind of backstory in education, because the context kind of gets to why I do what I do and talk about the issues that I talk about. So, I was a mid-career switcher. I became a fifth grade teacher in the South Bronx literally 20 years ago. Like 20 years ago this month, I think I started teaching my first summer school classes at PS 18 in the South Bronx, and then taught fifth grade for 5 years at a low performing public school nearby, PS 277, in the Mott Haven district of the South Bronx. This is the same neighborhood that Jonathan Kozol has written, a shelf of books about, for example. So it's at the time, and I think maybe still is, the lowest income zip code in America. Generation after generation of failing school, really low performing, bad test scores, you name it. So that was the context for my own, teaching career, spending 5 years teaching in what was literally the lowest performing school in the lowest performing school district in New York City. And the fact that I was a mid-career switcher, I think, may be relevant merely because, as I sometimes joke, I had not been in an elementary school since I'd been an elementary school student. So it'd been like 30 years, since I, had set foot in one. And as a result, I didn't come right out of ed school. I had 6 weeks of teacher boot camp under the New York City Teaching Fellows, and then they, hand me the key to the classroom and good luck and Godspeed.
Right.
I remember saying, like, this does not look like anything I remember about elementary school. The things I'm being taught or told are best practice. I don't think this is how we did it back in the day. And that would be okay if we had the results to prove the efficacy of these ways that I was being taught to teach, reading, most specifically math to a slightly lesser degree. But we didn't. I mean, the test scores were abysmal. So, and maybe we talked about this last time I was on your podcast. My trajectory went from kind of willing suspension of disbelief to skepticism to anger, to militance. I became a bit of obstreperous on some of these things. And as I know we mentioned last time, I became, an unapologetic disciple of E.D. Hirsch Jr. of core knowledge fame, for the simple reason that, I say this all over, or all the time. He was the one guy whose work described what I was seeing in that South Bronx classroom every single day. Kids who could decode, who could, read the words, say the words out loud, but struggled with even the most rudimentary reading comprehension exercises. So his work became my work, basically.
Right.
And, I'm kind of like, I like to think I could be his John the Baptist in a sense, kind of
Right.
evangelizing on behalf of this Hersheyan view of the world. And that's what I've pretty much done for the last, 15 or 20 years.
Well, I think what we need to do is we need to, for those in the audience who aren't familiar with E.D. Hirsch and aren't familiar with core knowledge and so forth, let's, if you could differentiate between, at a high level, core knowledge, which is what you and I grew up with, okay,
Whether
as a
we
curriculum.
realize it or not. That's right.
Right, you may
Yeah.
not know it's called that, but we're gonna,
Yeah.
define it for you. And then it's more of a standards-based, kind of curriculum. So,
Yeah. I mean, there's a
I
lot
mean,
to
that's what
unpack
they're
here.
calling it or something,
I should be making notes, like we need to unpack standards and accountability and what's the
E
difference between standards and
exactly.
curriculum, etc.
Right,
Um, but we're already speaking in code, so there was no core knowledge curriculum when you and I were in school, Deb. But what there was a basic, there was kind of a common elementary school trajectory. Oh, you learned, the old cliche about first you learn to read and then you read to learn. So I don't remember a single day of explicit reading instruction, ELA
no,
class,
right,
after, say, second or third grade. What did we do? We did science, we did social studies, we went to art, we went to music. In other words, we learned stuff. And now, in my elementary school 20 years ago, it was ELA, it was math, or it wasn't happening. And that, to your very good point, is the direct result of kind of the standards and accountability movement, which we should also make some time to talk about. But Hirsch, it's interesting because when I discovered Hirsch's work on my own, and when I would bring his ideas up in my professional development, in my ed school classes, almost without fail, somebody would say, "Oh, that's that dead white guy stuff. Nobody takes that seriously." And my response was, "Whoa, wait a minute. It has nothing to do with that. It
right,
has to do with reading comprehension, with background knowledge, with what reading comprehension really is and how it works."
right.
A quick funny story about Hirsch. If people remember him, it's usually because of his book, and I shouldn't speak of him in the past tense. He's 94 years old and as sharp as a tack and still writing.
Right.
Um, if people know Hirsch, it tends to be because of this kind of out of left field bestseller from 1987. One of those books that absolutely everybody bought and maybe not everybody read. It was called Cultural Literacy, and the reason it was a runaway bestseller, like literally the number one bestseller in the New York Times for 6 months running, was because that book came out at the exact same moment that Trivial Pursuit was a craze. And
Yeah.
Hirsch's Cultural Literacy had a list in the back of, I think it was like 5,000 things that every American should know. So this became basically the cheat sheet for Trivial Pursuit, and everybody bought it and read that. I don't mean to trivialize his work; it's profound and important. But when I say it's about reading comprehension, and when I said earlier that like he was describing the conditions that I saw in my South Bronx classroom, I meant that in the most literal way.
Mhm.
What the reason that my kids could decode, could read the words, and struggled with comprehension was because they lacked background knowledge. They lacked vocabulary. I mean, that's all of Hirsch's work, overly simplified. It's background knowledge, stupid. In other words, and my own personal analogy that I've taken to using to describe this is, imagine a reading passage like the child's game of Jenga, that block tower game, where and every one of those individual blocks is a little bit of background knowledge or a vocabulary word. Well, if you've played Jenga, you can pull out one or two of them, maybe even four or five of them. Everything's fine. At some point, you pull out one too many, and the entire thing collapses. This is what befuddles teachers. They say, well, how could you not understand this? The answers are literally in the text. Hirsch's work shows that, and this is his analogy, I believe, a reading passage is kind of like an iceberg. So what's above the ice is vocabulary and or the words rather, the decoding. But what's below the surface, the vast majority of the bulk of the iceberg is below the surface. It's context, it's the gist, and in other words, language kind of works like a bit of shorthand. Um, if you were talking and I say, well, that would, I really opened Pandora's box. I don't need to explain to you what that means. You get the illusion because you learned, Greek mythology. So, Hirsch's insight is, and the reason the book was called Cultural Literacy, is because language is a cultural construct. Um, the words we use, the context in which we use them, reflect common understandings of words, of idioms, of allusions to art and music and literature, etc. So the entire language is basically like a bit of shorthand. And if kids don't learn that that same common shared knowledge, well, then they're going to have those moments of, I read it, but I didn't get it. And you and I will think, well, how could you not get it? It's right there. But again, like that Jenga game, if they're missing critical bits of background knowledge of vocabulary, at some point a critical mass is reached and all comprehension is lost. I mean, that's a wildly oversimplified version of Hirsch's insights and work, but that's basically the gist.
And a lot of parents ask me, okay, that makes sense, but how did we get that background knowledge into us before? Because they don't remember, nor do I, for that matter, remember specifically, as you said, lessons in background knowledge. It's not like they sat there and drilled us with the 5,000 things that we were supposed to know. So they'll say, well, how did we used to do, or how should we, leaving aside the past, how should we get this in there? Because you've got part of the education establishment saying, you don't want to put that in there, it's bad. It, as you said, dead white guys, whatever, that's bad. It's discriminatory, whatever it is. And then other people saying, no, I actually would like to have it to discard. It's like, can I have it first and then I'll decide if I need it later, or can I have it plus some other new stuff, So how do we get it in there?
How did we? I mean,
how did we, and then how might we now?
It's a great question. I mean, if I wanted to argue against it, I would say, well, look, back in the day, Pondiscio, when you absorbed all this through your pores, it was because you were part of the dominant language culture. In other words, the stuff you read, the stuff you consumed, your world reflected a certain white Eurocentric point of view, and so you absorbed it through your pores, so to speak. That's not an unfair criticism. I think the larger point is you can't control language. It is what it is. I kind of liken it to the Mississippi River. You can try to you can try to direct it. You can build levees, but at some point, if it floods, it floods. You can't control it. So this really raises a profound challenge for students, especially. I mean, every kid I've ever taught has been a low-income kid of color. And what that means is if I reject the view of Hirsch that language is what it is, and what equity means is that you need to share with those children what you know, otherwise you are imposing a form of illiteracy on them. I mean, I don't know that he would say it that way. I'm saying it that way because I think it's literally true. In other words, it's possible to be wrong for all the right reasons. You can earnestly think to yourself, well, look, it's important to me that I honor a child's home language and home culture, and that I not impose a Eurocentric curriculum on him or her. That's not only a not a bad thing. That's a noble sentiment. But if the dominant language culture assumes that a whole raft of information, allusions, idiomatic language, etc., well, then you're really doing those kids a disservice. So you can be, again, wrong for all the right reasons. You can be, kind but cruel, as it were. And I think I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have the right answer. But as I said before, language doesn't care what we think. It is what it is. And I think at some point we have to make a decision as educators that we're going to acknowledge that and usher children into the world of full literacy because of equity, or we're going to say, oh, no, we're not going to do that because it makes us feel bad. But then we're going to launch children out into the world with less than full literacy and frankly less than full citizenship.
Well, and I think too, we're negating the good that was in that material, aside from the fact, how does something become dominant? It's not just because the majority of people are the majority of the people or that culture, because we've been a culture of immigrants since
Sure.
we began. And yet that was still the cultural literacy in 1987 when he wrote that book still reflected this sort of, Western Eurocentric, et cetera, et cetera. Although I still
Yeah.
think there's a lot of other influences. But I think back to something like Marva Collins' way of doing things, where she was classically educated primarily by her dad. I mean, she did go to school, but her father made her read the classics. Her father taught her to do these things. And then when she was teaching in the South Side of Chicago, she did likewise with her students. So they're reading Plato and Aristotle and Shakespeare and all this. And people were saying, why are you making these kids in the South Side of Chicago read this? And her point of view was because it's wonderful literature. It teaches them, the complexities of the written word, and it teaches them about themes that are, stand the test of time. Why is something a classic? It stands the test of time. And because of cultural literacy, and also, to challenge them. And her whole thing too is why not them?
Yeah.
Kind of what's the good reason to deny them access to this? If there are going to be people in this culture who have easier access to this, why would I deny it to the children who have less easy access to it? And that always resonated with me. It felt like you're depriving
That's
the
right.
students, almost like a hegemonic kind of a curriculum. You
Yeah.
get this, but you don't.
Well, no, I think that's exactly right, but it does make us a little bit queasy because it does have overtones of race and class. It just does. I mean, I wish I could solve that for you. I cannot.
Yeah, yeah.
But I want to go back to something you said earlier or asked earlier that I didn't really quite address, which is, hey,
Oh,
where did we get it? Get it
yeah,
from?
exactly.
And that's kind of a fascinating question because the world was a little bit different, 30, 40 years ago. It was still a world of 3 television networks. It was still a world where,
True.
200 million people watched the Oscars, for example, where we all watched the same things on TV. We all consumed the same media. There were limited gatekeepers. And so we were all kind of absorbing, the same basic schema, as it were. And I mean, I can't prove this, but I've always wanted to kind of study this a little bit. I also think that the culture was simply more literate 40 or 50 years ago. If you want to be kind of interested or appalled sometime, go back and watch some of those old Disney movies from like the 60s, like Bedknobs and Broomstick or Mary Poppins. The vocabulary is stunning. I mean, and the amount of time that the camera holds its gaze, it just felt to me like it was, again, I'm not. This is not mere nostalgia. I mean, I think you would actually probably get the screenplays of these movies and run them through a Lexile computer, and it would show you. I bet my last dollar that the language complexity and vocabulary sophistication was off the charts compared to what it is now. So I think there was a more linguistically rich environment 50 or so years ago. So it was both common culture. We had shared illusions. The language was more sophisticated. There was that. And remember things like, Looney Tunes,
I was
remarkably
just going to
sophisticated
say, I learned so
vocabulary.
much about classical music from Looney
So,
Tunes.
so exactly, not just that, but I mean, illusions. I mean, I fell in love with Monty Python when I was in middle
Yeah.
school, and I look at
Yeah.
it now and I think, wow, that's like they're talking about philosophers and authors, and they're making jokes about architects and whatnot. I mean, it was a very, very sophisticated time. And look, I mean, just to personalize it in my own specific instance, I grew up in a fairly, middle class, even lower middle class, blue collar home on Long Island. But my parents, were news consumers. We had the encyclopedia. They valorized reading, and I kind of grew up with the idea that, people you're supposed to know things. In other words, you're supposed to pay attention to what's going on in the world. One simple thing that I often counsel teachers and schools about is, and this gets back to the way that I was taught to teach reading. This is the opposite. It's like, not everything can be mirrors. Not everything should be about the child's own experience. Focus attention out the window. Current events. I mean, I remember doing current events when I was in elementary school. That was an elementary school staple because it was just valorized, right? That you're supposed to know what's going on in the world. An informed and educated person pays attention to things and knows things. We may have lost touch with that a little bit, and now we've kind of turned students' gaze inward instead of outward. So, as a general impulse, regardless of the curriculum, if we could return to that kind of, secular idea of, the lookout that elementary school should be focusing kids' attention out the window, so to speak, not exclusively, but much more so than it is right now. David Coleman of the College Board, and I'm sure a lot of folks are associate him with Common Core and have a negative association. But he said a lovely thing many years ago in defense of Common Core, saying that he wanted to see elementary school teachers restored to their rightful place as guides to the universe. That's what's different, Deb. I think what's different now is we've completely given up that idea that elementary school should be to spark wonder about the outside world and introduce children with awe to their surroundings. Now it's all about me. And again, I could, if I wanted to steel man that, I could absolutely explain why that is a good and humane thing. But for the purposes of language sophistication, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think it also teaches the child, my opinion anyway, it teaches the child that the world should reflect them, so not just, look inward, but they get further separated from process. Like, how do things become what they are? How do things get, how does food get in the refrigerator? How does the car drive? How do things happen? I've met high school students who have very primitive understanding of how just the basic economy works. I'm not expecting them to be Thomas Sowell. I'm just saying, if you genuinely believe that you can, just raise wages to whatever the heck you want them to be, and it won't have any negative impact on the cost of things. And even when you explain it, even once you say, well, do you understand that this is connected to this is connected to this? They're like, they just glaze over. And that should be readily accessible to your average high school graduate. I mean, there just shouldn't be something that somebody who's 18 years old struggles to comprehend. They might say like, oh yeah, you're right. I could see that. But, I was sort of impulsive and immature. I didn't think about that. But there are too many kids going, no, you're wrong. And I want it this way. And I'm like, now you sound like you're 5. So, so that brings me to my next point, which is elementary school. Again, I have some memories of it, but I don't remember how we got this way. I feel like more was expected of us, even in elementary school, in terms of just our own personal, individual performance isn't really the right word, because I'm not really speaking in terms of grades, but just responsibility for, doing things, whether it's your own work in the classroom or writing legibly or spelling or, like you said, there was the knowing things and there was the doing things.
Yeah.
And I felt like we were expected to try to learn something every day. So we knew a little bit more than the day before in terms of just stuff. And then I also feel like we were constantly working on some kind of skill. So either it was, your handwriting, your spelling, your math skills. And I'm seeing that missing, any kind of like a logical progression that is being checked up on to make sure you're making really incremental progress on those things that you personally will carry around with you, as opposed to, well, let's go work in a group and how do you feel today and stuff.
Well, I'll tell you what, I get the willies when I hear the word skill, and not in the context in which you used it, but in the context in which it's typically used. How many times do you hear, perhaps even how many times have you said as a teacher, well, content doesn't matter, facts don't matter, we need to teach skills, critical thinking, problem solving, communication, creativity. 20 years ago, there was this whole, I hope it's gone, 21st century skills movement that valorized.
Oh, it's still going on. Big time.
Old wine, new bottles. But the idea is one of those kind of, horror movie monsters that you can kill it and it doesn't stay dead.
Yeah.
Here I'm going to invoke not Hirsch, but Dan Willingham, my good friend who was a cognitive science professor at the University of Virginia. He did, well, I mean, okay, forget everything in my mouth. When we're done, go over to YouTube and take a look at a video that he posted 15 years ago with the title "Teaching Content is Teaching Reading." It's the best 10 minutes you'll spend, in your life if you care about education. Dan makes the point quite convincingly, and I mean, it's not that it's an unimpeachable point. that all of the things that we think of as skills are really kind of knowledge in disguise. In other words,
True. Hmm.
that you can't teach someone to be an all-purpose critical thinker. You can only critically think about the things that you understand well. There
True.
was a paper, and I think I learned this from Dan. It was called, could Steven Spielberg manage the Yankees? And the answer is no, because, well, yes, Steven Spielberg is a creative genius, but he is a creative genius filmmaker. There's no reason to think that he has the quote domain knowledge to be successful, more successful than Aaron Boone in the dugout in the South Bronx, managing
Right.
the Yankees. In other words, in order to be really an expert at something, you have to know what the expert knows. So when you hear people saying things like, well, we don't need to teach science, we need to teach kids how to think like a scientist. Well, no, that's science cosplay. That is well, I'm serious, or that's
No,
science
I know. It's a great way to
appreciation.
put it, though. I like it.
Yeah, and getting back to reading, I got myself in trouble with this because I wrote a piece some years ago about what I called cargo cult reading. And this is exactly the way I was taught to teach reading, to my struggling fifth graders. So Richard Feynman, the great scientist, wrote this thing many years ago about cargo cults, which are apparently they were real things. So the backstory here is, and my dad was a GI in World War II in the South Pacific, so he may have seen some of this. There were these tribesmen in various islands in the South Pacific who, what did they see during World War II? They saw planes land and all this cool stuff came out of the planes. Um, and then the war ended. The soldiers went away. Well, they wanted the planes to come back. So what did they do? With their dim understanding of what they had been witnessing, they built. And you can Google this. They built control towers out of bamboo. They would put somebody, in the tower with sticks on the side of their head because in other words, they were emulating the things that they saw soldiers do that made the planes land. Well, of course the planes didn't land because that's not why planes were landing because they built runways and control towers and whatnot. But if you think about it, this is exactly what we teach kids to do when it comes to reading. We teach them the habits of good readers. I did this every damn day at PS 277. Well, scholars, good readers notice what characters are thinking. And now today and every day you're going to go back to your book and you're going to notice what characters say and do. And so we have all these lists of things that we do, these
Takes the
skills.
joy out of it too.
Well, yeah,
I'm so
there's
glad
that.
I didn't learn to read that way. It would just be
there
so like, can I just read the book?
Right.
Like,
There is that too. That it's just kind of, takes the pleasure out of it. But we think we are teaching kids comprehension strategies when we are teaching them cargo cult reading. We're teaching them to emulate what good readers do, but we are not sharing with them what good readers know. So you can't have one without the other. You can't do
right,
what the good reader does unless you know what the good reader knows.
right.
This is, again, this is, Hirsch's insight and Willingham's as well. But that's simply not not the way I was taught to teach reading.
It
So there's
seems
no,
to
in other
me
words, there's no shortcut for this. So when
no,
I'm going on about this, forgive me, but when you invoke
no.
skills, I just get my hackles up because, there's a 2 hour long talk I give about reading comprehension. And I always say the same thing. I say, look, if you take nothing else from this talk,
Hmm.
please remember these 5 words. Reading is not a skill.
That's true.
Because we
But you'll
feel
notice
like
I
it is.
didn't say reading, did I? I said spelling and math, but it's okay.
Okay.
No, but no, but it's a good point, and I'm glad you brought it up because that shows me that the way I use skill, even around those things, is very different than the way people are using skill today. And one of the things I've been trying to get across, tell me what you think of this to parents, is that like anything else, being a good reader takes practice. And one of the ways that you will be inspired to practice, and by practice, I don't mean just read a lot of books at the same level with the same type of vocabulary that you already know how to read. I mean, pushing yourself a little bit into things that might be slightly uncomfortable and above your level and so forth. Um, is you have to have what you said, that belief that there's a point to it, that there's something contained in those books, an adventure, a story, some knowledge, something worth knowing, something worth being part of or experiencing, that it's worth that challenge. That there's some big words in there and the print's kind of small
Yeah.
and there aren't any pictures in this one like that were in the last one, but you know what, without those pictures, you can imagine these amazing things. And so when I was teaching my own kids to read, I homeschooled them through those grades. I read to them a lot. So my thought, and this was more instinctive than anything I learned in teacher school, okay, was that the way that to help them become good readers was to model good reading, was to
Yeah.
just be like super passionate and joyful and pick stories
Sure.
that I had loved and do the voices and do the whole
Yep.
thing and have them be transported
Yep.
through the
And look,
experience.
that's a good thing. What you just, I mean, and for what it's worth, this is also. Let me kind of give some praise to some aspects of the way I was taught to teach reading. We did read alouds every day in my school, and that is a very good thing for the reasons that you describe. Because that's fluency, right? You want them to hear what it sounds like, you want to, in that way, emulate a good reading habit. So what you're modeling, to use your word, fluent reading. That's a very, very good thing. Another good thing you were doing, whether you realize it or not, and please, I hope I'm not condescending here.
No,
The
I
the
want other
the
parents to hear this so they can do it too.
we know that a child's ability to process text through their eyes, so to speak, to read, doesn't catch up to their ability to do so orally through their ears until middle school, till age 13, 14. So in other words, reading levels are complicated and there's a lot less there than meets the eye. But that said, a child can take in and enjoy and comprehend a sophisticated text far beyond their ostensible reading level for a very long time. In other words, you've got the reading level, the oral reading level. They don't meet up until about age 14. So that's a great way to build background knowledge, build vocabulary, hear much more complex text than they could read independently for a very long time. So that's a very good thing too. And look, the other thing, and this is where I'm going to praise that which I usually condemn. There is something to be said for simply volume of reading, right? So in other words, what the folks who were kind of eschewing Hirsch and whatnot got right is, look, if getting kids to read texts that they choose themselves because it's about them and it interests them, if that inspires them to read more, well, that is a good thing, right? So it's hard to force feed text to kids, to books to kids. In other words, you can't take Harry Potter out of their hands and say, no, read Anne of Green Gables instead. They're
Right.
going to want to read Harry Potter, and that's okay. Ideally, you want to have a diet of both, self-selected and assigned reading to build that background knowledge, to build that cultural literacy. But there is, at the very least, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a high volume of reading virtually anything. We know from, I believe this was work done by Keith Stanovich and Anne Cunningham at the University of Toronto, that the language of even children's books is far more sophisticated than the oral language of you and I right now. In other words, college graduates, um, uh, linguistic complexity, vocabulary complexity is less sophisticated than even children's books. So there are absolutely gains to be made by reading virtually anything,
Mhm.
but in an ideal world, you want to shape their reading so that they're taking in as much, doing what we were reflecting on earlier, that they're getting the science, the history, the art, the music, the whole big, broad, fascinating world, not
Right.
just about me.
Right, exactly. And you had mentioned in the last show, you said you felt like, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but if we could focus on this, this one thing, this reading thing, so that they were, fluent readers with, on their way to,
Yeah.
being culturally literate by, I don't know, was it third grade, fifth grade, whatever, but in that frame of elementary school, that we could, that so many other problems would be improved. Like things would fall into place for those kids. Am I getting it kind of right?
I mean, directionally, yeah. I mean, there are no magic bullets, and this one isn't
Right.
either. A guy I know once quipped memorably, and I stole this line, that there's no such thing as a magic bullet, but there might be magic buckshot, meaning you got to get a lot of things going in the right direction. It can't be just one.
Okay.
But if a genie appears to you or I tonight, and you get one wish and one wish only for improving American education, it should probably be early childhood literacy. Look, there's progress now. I mean, I'm kind of really heartened by what we're seeing in terms of the so-called science of reading, getting momentum in schools and districts and states across the country. I mean, at the risk of wonking out, it's important to not conflate decoding, the ability to kind of, read the words in the page, and comprehension. But what I was probably implying in what you were suggesting is like, look, if we could get every kid decoding, able to read process language by, say, third grade, then that would be a good thing. And if that genie comes to me, I'm going to say, okay, here's what else I want. Can we have a common curriculum? Oh, here we go. Common curriculum. You're a Marxist. No, no, no. I'm just concerned about literacy. I would argue for a common curriculum, at least in elementary school. Build that basic. I mean, Hirsch would probably argue for through eighth grade. His sequence goes through eighth grade. I'm a reasonable man. I'll take K through 5. If you were able to build a common foundation of knowledge in elementary school, if every elementary school student learned more or less the same stuff, well, then that would create the foundation to do all the differentiation, all of the individualization that you want in middle school and high school. So I would rather, impose, as it were, a common curriculum for elementary school to make individual pursuits meaningful in middle school and high school and beyond, as opposed to doing what we do now, which is from the first days of schools. Well, what do you want to learn today, children? And then by the time we realize that they have these fatal gaps in their knowledge and language, it's just too late to remediate.
Well, also, I mean, I wanted to keep this sort of academically focused as a show, but I feel like I have to bring it up now. If there's a common curriculum, or we want kids to learn the same things and have the same core knowledge, but what about the principles underpinning that knowledge? So, for example, when I was in elementary school, the one thing that was underlying all of it still in the 70s was that I was an individual person who was going to grow up and make individual choices. And while I lived in a country and I was going to be a citizen and all this kind of stuff, I was still responsible for myself and my own, performance and all this and my own behavior. And so there was sort of a value set that was individualistic underneath all of it. And then there was also this sense of not jingoistic patriotism, but a notion that America was essentially good, with some things
Yeah.
that maybe we need. So I guess my point is, one of my concerns with saying, okay, if you go talk to some of the people today, they'll say, we're teaching them all the same stuff. It's just stuff that you and I look at and go, yeah, that's kind of the problem. You're not letting them even question the stuff that they're teaching you, and their parents disagree and a whole lot of other people disagree. And it's a common curriculum,
Yeah.
but what is it saying? So what about that?
Well, I mean, I think I'd make it even more rudimentary than that. And then we're going to focus like a laser on elementary school. I mean, something that Hirsch points out, and I should have said this earlier on because this is maybe a better way to understand Hirsch's central insights than what I was talking about. He would argue that, look, literate people know things, or educated speakers and writers make assumptions about what their audiences know. And when those assumptions are correct, then language works fluidly. When those assumptions are incorrect, language falls apart. So so in other words, the way to think about what this means, or the importance of this, is this is not imposing an orthodoxy. This is not imposing a canon. This is a curatorial effort. And that's what his work really is. His core knowledge sequence was basically putting hundreds of people together and say, okay, what should every first grader know? What should every second grader know? What is that mental furniture, that storehouse of knowledge that literate people assume other literate people know, and rely upon the knowing to communicate? Teach that. So, in other words, I don't want to be naive and say that you can completely lift that out of the realm of values and whatnot. But for elementary school, my longstanding assumption has been, if you took people in all 50 states and went through that exercise, put teachers and parents and others together and say, okay, let's figure out what do kids need to know in kindergarten? Oh, okay, shapes and colors and numbers and landforms in first grade and whatnot. I would wager my last dime that you'd get something like 95% overlap. People, you might put shapes and colors in pre-K. I might put them in kindergarten, but nobody's going to say, "Oh yeah, no, kids don't need to know shapes and colors. That's nonsense." so I mean, the mischief is the stuff that comes after that. Oh, what are we going to teach them about creationism and what about sex ed and whatnot? I'm not there yet. Let's focus on building that common knowledge base
Hmm.
in elementary school, so we can have basic communications with each other. So those differences in debates are meaningful later
Right.
on. But if you
That's
view
what's
elementary school as just kind of a foundational, literally foundational, the building blocks of knowledge that go into language and critical reasoning and whatnot, it's just a very different conversation.
Well, it's like the classical educators, that's why they call it the grammar phase, the grammar
Exactly.
stage. It's
That's right.
you're building that foundation, and then you move on to a rhetoric or logic and then rhetoric. And what I've noticed in elementary school lately is they start right away with concepts. And we're talking about little
Right.
concrete thinkers who don't have background knowledge, they don't have vocabulary, they can't read, they can't do even basic math. And if you start with concepts, you're not just at a place they're not cognitively, so they have to just accept what you say as fact. You're like, take scaffolding and tear down the scaffold. It's just like, here, believe it. And
Yeah.
the kids who want to please are just going to go, okay, you're way past any zone of proximal development at this point. And
Yeah.
and that's what concerns me, is that what they're calling skills
Yeah.
are really memorization of ideas and concepts that have been deemed acceptable for that particular environment. And that's what concerns me, is the kids don't have, they're not equipped. And it doesn't feel right to me that they should be doing that. I like what you described. What you described elementary school should be, I think, is what most parents want and what most parents thought they were getting. I've met
Boom.
so many parents,
Yeah,
and
exactly right.
just this past weekend, I said, "Y'all know that you don't have a knowledge based curriculum anymore, right?" And they looked at me like, "What's that? What do you mean?"
What?
And I described what you and I've been talking about, and then I described what actually is, and the jaws were dropping. They were like,
I'm laughing, and I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny, Deb. But I
"No, it
worked
isn't."
for the Core Knowledge Foundation for several years after I left the classroom, and I had this experience serially. I would describe, oh, what's core knowledge? What's the core knowledge sequence? What's knowledge rich? And I would describe, well, it's making sure the kids get history and art and science and 9 times out of 10, a non-educator and even frankly some people in education would say, well, doesn't every school do that?
I know,
Like,
right? You're
no,
like,
no,
"No."
they don't. Yeah, because we have that model that you and I remember from back in the day, where that is what elementary schools did. So I mean, and that's one of the things that makes this kind of uncool, right? Because it's so much more fun to say, oh no, we're going to teach critical thinking and problem solving and project-based learning and blah blah blah. Well, no, you're not. You're going to teach cosplay. You're going to teach going through the motions of these things, and you're going to impress yourself so much that the kids can do it when it's about a subject that they know. But then when the skill doesn't transfer, you're going to say, well, what did I do wrong? Well, no, that skill doesn't transfer. They can think critically and problem solve when they have the background knowledge, but when they don't, they're babes. It's
Or
not
when you
gonna
give
not gonna
them the
work.
steps. What I'm seeing in the kids I tutor are that they're given such prescribed steps.
Yeah,
Step one, do this. It's like fill in the blank, right? Well, that's not critical thinking. If the teacher
right.
gives you, this is step one and this is step two, or here's how you write an essay, is you put a topic sentence and it has to have 10 words and it has to be this and it has to be that. And then when you try to get them to do something from their own mind, they're absolutely lost. They've no,
Yeah.
without the form, the little like what do they call these now? Graphic
Oh, graphic
organizers.
organizers. That's right. Yeah.
Without all
Paint
their
by
little
numbers.
graphic organizers, they have no
Yeah.
idea what to do.
Well,
That's
it's
not
it's it's
thinking.
almost worse than that. At least paint my numbers back in the day. It
Yeah.
said 20. Oh, that's white. Oh, that's 17. That's blue. At least I could, follow along and make it look like something. The graphic
Yes.
organizers are worse than
Right.
useless if you don't know what to fill them
But
in
the
with.
average parent didn't study child development in school. They don't
Now,
understand the human brain development at all, like what each part of the brain does and all that. And I'm wondering, are they not teaching it to teachers anymore?
no, I think they are, but that's actually making the problem worse, not better. In
Oh.
other words, again, I don't want to oversimplify complicated concepts and sophisticated work here, but whenever somebody talks about developmentally appropriate practice, for example, reach for your skepticism, whatever it is. In other words, developmentally appropriate practice, it sounds very sophisticated and knowing, but everything can be developmentally appropriate if the kid has the requisite background knowledge and interest and vocabulary and whatnot. So it's not like there's this magical stage. This was Vygotsky, um, who popularized the idea of stage theory. First, kids can do this, then there's a stage, and then they can do that. Well, that doesn't work that way. I mean, every kid can do everything as long as at any point. It has nothing to do with their age and a stage. It has to do with the preparation for that task. So that's, there's any number of ideas that we have in education that are a lot more fun than let's build background knowledge, like teaching critical thinking, like, oh, I'm going to teach kids to think like a historian, or, or read like a detective. Yeah, you're probably not. But there's any number of these things that just feel more fun and sophisticated. So we don't do the necessary work of building knowledge. The skill stuff that we talked about is a good example of that. I wrote a piece not long ago about like learning myths that need to die. The most obvious one is learning styles. We still have this
Oh my God,
idea that,
that's so bogus.
you're an
That is
auditory learner and I'm a kinesthetic learner. Yeah, you're
no,
not.
no.
That's not a thing. That one will never go away. But we do things like that instead of
I see it everywhere. I see it in
yeah.
school district websites. I see it in curriculum stuff. I mean, it is just, it will not die. And I keep telling parents, like, that's not real. That's not a thing. And they're
That's
so
not a
convinced
thing, right?
it
Yeah.
has to be. They're charging lots of money for it on this website. And they're like, no, it's not real. Um, okay. Last question, because I know you've got a hard stop. What you just said about, well, it's a lot more fun to do this, that, and the other. Is it though? I mean, I'm asking because I do want to bust the myth wide open that teaching or even learning a core knowledge based curriculum is boring and drab
Oh,
and rudimentary, whatever. I want
yeah,
people to
no.
understand that, I mean, because again, I homeschooled during these ages and I absolutely gave my kids the core knowledge curriculum and they were having a blast. Kids love to know things. They love to learn things.
That's exactly right. Kids are innately curious about the world. They love knowing stuff. They love showing off what they know. Which is, just when you're 7 years old, like, regaling, your parents with what you learned about dinosaurs is just like the coolest thing ever. When your parents go, "How did you learn
Exactly.
that?" Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be unkind. I'm not a teacher basher, but as a general rule, when teachers say, "Well, kids find that boring," I tend to think that means you find it boring, or you're not interested in finding a way to make this engaging and fun for your kids. Um, and look, again, I'm not a teacher basher. I don't want to be unkind, but once you kind of see language for what it is, once you understand, the essential role of background knowledge and vocabulary, then you kind of have something close to a moral obligation to say, look, it doesn't matter what I like teaching. I need to teach this. I'm doing these kids
Yep.
a disservice if I don't do this. So either I better find a way to make this fun and interesting and engaging, or I better do something else. I mean, something else for a living. It's not about you. It's not about your interest. I mean, look, I had every spring or early summer after the tests were over, I used to love building water rockets with my fifth graders. We would go outside and build these pressurized water rockets. We'd get wet and silly, and it was great fun. But that felt like, we were doing that as an activity because it was cool. There's some science involved, etc. That wasn't every day in my classroom. That wasn't I'm going to do what's fun because I want to keep the kids engaged. you know, I think that impulse has been, again, it's a laudable impulse. Nobody wants kids to dread going to school. Alfie Kohn, wrongly lampoons us. He insists that there's still schools where kids are sitting in rows reciting,
No, there aren't.
Battle of Hastings. I was like, I have trolled him mercilessly on Twitter for years, and he's never responded once. Raising the stakes, I'm up to $10,000, saying, Alfie Kohn, here's $10,000 for the charity of your choice if you can take me to a single school anywhere in America that is doing these things that you insist schools are doing. It doesn't happen. He's never
Exactly.
responded. He will never respond. It doesn't happen. And in other words, the damage is more subtle than that. It's this idea of, I want kids to be engaged. I want them to love learning. So therefore, it's a humane response. Let's make school and learning about what you want to learn about, as opposed to, hey kids, there's stuff that people know and assume you know, and you need to know that too.
Right, right.
I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know how to solve that problem, but I think what has kept me in this work for 20 years is, once you see this clearly, and once you see it for what it is, and you realize that there's what I want and there's what it is, and I have a moral obligation to not just meet the kids where they are, but understand what they need to know and ensure that they leave me knowing it. It's a game changer. I know that's a cliche, but it changes the nature of how you approach this work.
Right, right. So I think that's really helpful. I think parents listening to what you've said today are going to have a better idea of what, what is actually going on in elementary school, what's missing, what probably we should work on getting back there, or just bringing there in the first place, to the extent that it wasn't there as well as it could have been even then. I'm not saying my elementary education was perfect. I think we could do better than that, but we have a far distance to go from today
Well,
in terms of making
let's
what needs to
if I
be.
can, Deb, I don't want to host your show for you, but let's see if we can offer a few takeaways here. In other
Yes,
words,
please.
because that's a really good point. In other words, it's I used to say, boy, I want parents to be as sophisticated about curriculum as they are about medicine. Like, in other words, if your child has a stomach ache, you go on WebMD and you're prepared to have a really knowledgeable conversation with your pediatrician about medicines and side effects, etc. We have nothing like that for curriculum, and so we tend to allow these bad practices to take root because we don't know any better. I don't know that we're ever going to get to the point where we're going to have parents as sophisticated about curriculum as they are about about medicine. But look, there are probably a few things that you and I could come up with, like, hey, just red flags. When your teacher says, "Oh, we don't worry about facts, we worry about we teach critical thinking and problem solving," that's a red flag. When the teacher says, "Oh, it's important for me to differentiate instruction for a child's learning style," that's a big red flag. Um, when the teacher says we want the curriculum to be about them, to reflect the child's own interests, that's a red flag. When you ask the teacher, well, what are they learning right now in science and history and art and music? If they hear what teachers used to say in my old school, oh, all that stuff is good, but first they need to learn how to read. That's a big red flag, because they're not going to learn how to read with comprehension unless they get the history, the science, the art, the music, the big, broad range of things that, again, that people know and assume that you know. So if people say reading is a skill, that's a red flag. There's any number of things that parents could probably learn to, that an alarm bell will ring if they hear their child's teacher say.
That's fantastic. I think I may write this up and make these a list, as well as make a clip of just this, because wow, that's exactly what they're asking. Like, what should I look for? So thank you so much. And you can come host the show anytime.
Okay, here's what we'll do, Debbie. You and I are going to write this piece together. We're going to come up with a list. We'll say 10 things, 10,
Yeah.
10 questions to ask your child's teacher, or even five at parent teacher night, and what the answer should be and what the answer should not be. We will write the hell out of that. That'll be fun.
I, I'm holding you to that. I'm
Deal.
serious. I gotta tell
I
you
am
how many
too.
people came up to me at the Moms for Liberty thing saying, "Can you just give me a cheat sheet?" And I'm like,
Yeah,
"So
it's
let's
not too
do
much.
it." Absolutely. All right, guys, you heard it here. All right. Well, Robert, I hope you have a great rest of your day. I know you have some traveling to do, so please travel safely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us. And thanks everybody who came. Please like, share, and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. And I will see you next time.
Thanks,
Bye.
Deb. See you.